right? I'm April Edwards. I'm a senior developer advocate. No, what am I? Yes, I'm a senior developer advocate. They just changed our job titles at GitHub, and I'm a DevOps practice lead. So I've worked at Microsoft for about 5 years, just recently moved to GitHub. We're not the same organization. We work very independently, but we do integrate our technologies together. I'm based out of the UK, so I'm very local to you all. And this is my best friend, Titan, who's a 69-kilo Great Dane. He's sitting back in the UK. So if you're ever on a video call with me, he's usually sitting on the floor, helping me write code and messing up my code. So let's go ahead and thank our sponsors, because if it weren't for them, we wouldn't be here. So we have our friends at Chocolatey, who I'm a big fan of, Sentino, Scriptrunner, and Patch My PC, who has the best shirt at the conference, right? Except for the conference shirts, right? So I want to talk about platforms for a minute. We're going to talk about things, platforms, and doing projects. Is Ben in the audience? I can't see because I'm being blinded. He's not here. All right, we're going to pick on Ben in a minute. When we develop tools, we have a lot of options out there. Anytime we work on a project, we have all these options and tools and how we do things. So GitHub has turned itself into a platform, not just a source control. How many of you have never used GitHub in this room? So I'm going to go ahead and show the slide. If you guys were in my talk yesterday, I'm just going to go ahead and talk about it again, shifting left. Now, we all have stats and numbers about what happens when we do things in production. It costs us money when we get breaches, and it costs more money to us as an organization. So what we're seeing in the industry is more movement towards the developer experience. And we're going to use this word developer a lot at GitHub, but everyone here is a developer. If you tell a machine to do something for you, you are a developer. You may not be a programmer, but you're a developer. So I might say developer a lot. Forgive me, but actually, no, sorry, not sorry. But we're going to look at all the tooling that's helping us do things early and often. So we can implement security from day one, but also saving ourselves from production and headaches. So I'm going to talk a little bit about source control, why we need it. But most importantly, how many of you work on a team and use a Mac device? We got a few in here. How many of you use a Windows device? How about any Linux folks in here? We got one Linux guy, person. So at Microsoft, when I worked in engineering, I was one of 2 people on my team with a Windows device. All the other folks on my team had Macs. We had one person with a Linux device. On top of that, now I'm at GitHub, everyone has a Mac. When I joined GitHub, I was not given the option of Mac or PC. They're like, here's a Mac, you're going to love it. I've used Macs for years. I don't love them. They're not my thing. I love what my Windows 11 PC does. So they'll have to pry this out of my cold, dead fingers. So the reason why I give this talk is because we all write code. We do things with PowerShell. We're putting code into projects, or we're doing even infrastructure projects in our organizations. Getting started is hard. And when people have different devices, different experiences, different configurations, that messes up our code, right? We can, louder, yes. There we go. Coffee's working. So I'm just going to talk about source control a little bit, right? So GitHub started off as a source control platform. We all know that. Started off in 2008. About 5 years ago, Microsoft acquired them. So you're seeing all these features go into GitHub that weren't there before, because we are developing it as a platform, an end-to-end platform. So I think everyone here is probably familiar with what source control is and why we use it. So back in my day, 20-some-odd years ago, actually, true story, it was 2008. I was working in Colorado, and all of our PowerShell scripts were in file shares, right? I'd give my manager my files, he'd give me his, and I worked with a lot of people that would just hoard their code. So I never really understood open source in my career until much, much later. And then when I moved to Microsoft, everyone's like, yeah, here's my code, here's my documentation, here's my thing, and we shared. And I'm like, oh, this is new. This is nice. I like this sharing thing. I no longer am precious about everything I own. We talk about infrastructure as code. We talk about sharing code. Instead of treating our things like pets, we treat them like cattle. But we make it share. It helps enable us to do more. And this is where source control comes in. So when we have source control, we have what's called a Git project. So we're going to go over the components of a Git project. How many of you work in GitHub today to share your code around? All right, and how many of you that work in GitHub put a DevContainer in your project? 3.5 of you. That's a good number. So we need our code in our projects. That's an absolute number one. We need our code. Probably a git ignore file that files that we don't want to sync up, but we might need locally. And working off of branches. So we want to work off of a main working branch. We used to call this the master branch. This is now the main branch. Sometimes you will see master branch in documentation or in other people's repository. Highly encourage you all to change it to your main branch. This is like your source of truth. And then we create a branch and we work off of it so we don't screw up production. We don't screw up the main source of code. We want to make commits, and we want to do things like pull requests. How many of you have used a pull request? Fantastic, a good amount of you. So those are great practices. Might I say, great developer practices, right? So these are all things that are important in a project, and that's great. So a GitHub project, we want to make sure we document. How many of you love writing documentation? Yeah, you don't count. Oh, here's Ben. Ben, come up here for a minute. Come. This is Ben. Ben ran a session yesterday and said to me, I can't get VS Code working on my laptop. And I said, you on a Mac or PC? He's like, I'm on a Mac. I said, run it into code space. And he's like, no, I'm going to do it my way. Urgh. Ben, was I correct?
Yes.
So we're going to talk about code spaces, and we're going to talk about dev containers. Every day in my job, I write my code in a dev container, and it's either sitting in a GitHub code space, or I can use VS Code locally. I don't use VS Code locally anymore because my machine is janky. If you were in my session yesterday, the thing died for absolutely no reason. And working in combined teams, something that we need to do. So these features of a GitHub project are really, really important, okay? We have our repositories. We want to increase our collaboration. We want to break down silos. What's really important in our organizations is IT pros or engineers or developers, QA, testers, project managers. We want to break down these silos. And these are practices that are technical, and that's great, but it's also helping us change the culture in our organization and how we collaborate. And there's some great stats around using open source and collaboration and all that good stuff. So before we go into what a dev container is, I'm going to talk about containerization. How many of you have used containerization? Okay. So when I talk about containers, I want to take a little bit of a history lesson here. Back when I started my career 24 years ago, we had physical machines everywhere, physical boxes. I learned to build machines from scratch. I took my A+ certification back in the day. Took that one off my resume because I don't need that anymore. But I built machines, I built servers, and I remember physically networking an entire building and moving physical boxes around. And then we had this thing called virtualization come in. Who remembers virtualization? And we're all like, crap, we're going to be out of a job. So we had this thing. And then we go to this cloud model. And I want to talk a little bit about infrastructure as a service in the cloud. Now, I work pretty much entirely in the cloud these days. So if my laptop dies, I can still run my demo. If something happens, I have redundancy and recovery. So when we look at the cloud model here, we have infrastructure as a service. So we have our application. Underneath that, we have data and our operating system. That virtualization layer is now abstracted from us in the cloud in many ways. And a lot of you are probably running data centers with VMware or Hyper-V doing this exact same thing. So whether it's private or public, same stuff, different day, infrastructure as a service. So when virtualization came in, we're all like, okay, we're going to use that hardware layer, and we're going to abstract it with a virtualization product. So we have this virtual hardware. And each virtual machine runs an operating system. So you got like this one-to-many ratio. So you got one piece of hardware to many operating systems. Everyone with me? Yep. So we have multiple VMs. We have clusters of VMs. We have all these things that we do in our career. Then containers come around, and the cloud, right? And then everyone starts panicking. So when we start looking at containers, we're effectively virtualizing the operating system. So we're abstracting another layer. These technologies are not going to take your job away. And this is still very much an infrastructure play. So when I go around the world and talk about containerization and all this like Git, cool stuff, I'm talking to mostly infrastructure folks. Developers want to containerize their apps because they can run more apps on less hardware. There's also a huge push in the community right now to talk about green computing. And a lot of that comes down to containerization, microservices. So this is effectively how this works. We're abstracting that operating system again on a different level. So we're isolating everything, and we can have controls around that and everything else. The biggest thing I want to point out is we now have a portable application. So how many of you said, oh, it works on my machine? Yeah? We don't have that conversation anymore. Now, my machine may die, but everything I'm going to do today is going to be in the cloud. And I could take any one of your laptops and run my entire demo because I'm abstracting my machine out of the equation. Because machines break, and I have to make the assumption hardware fails. We use commodity hardware in our data centers all over the world. So this is effectively what it looks like. This is Docker's view of what a containerized application looks like. You run the Docker operating system. Now you could have the Docker image. You can have a Linux or Windows OS under this. And it actually doesn't matter. So what I'm going to talk about today is a dev container. Now, this is what a dev container looks like in Visual Studio Code, right? In a local operating system with Visual Studio Code, we have Visual Studio Code installed. We run our source code. And then with a containerized environment, we have that, we mount the volume, and it runs a whole set of other processes underneath it, okay? I will provide you all with a link if you really want to do a deep dive into how VS Code does this and how dev containers work to that level. We will certainly go through that. So when you have a containerized environment in your machine, so I can run this dev container on my machine, I can run it in the cloud, I can run it anywhere I want to go. And I can run it in your machine, your machine, your machine, and your machine. Does not matter. You do need a few prerequisites to run it locally on your operating system on your device. You do need Docker Desktop installed. If you're running in an enterprise environment, you need Docker licensing for that. They've changed that model because they want to make money as an open source company. Can't blame them. But there's a way to run it without Docker on your machine as well on a Windows device. But when we run this containerized environment in VS Code or running any container, there's going to be two files that we really, really need. And we're going to talk through those in a minute. First, we need a devcontainer.json file. This is your config file. This is where we're going to install and run all the applications we need. And I'm going to show you how this works in a minute. Next up, we have the Docker file. This is the simple instructions of how to build your container. So your machine's going to run through it and go, okay, this is what I need to do it. Great. So I want to talk about GitHub code spaces because we're not going to run this locally on my machine. We're going to run this in the cloud. GitHub code spaces were developed. They were originally called Visual Studio code spaces, I believe. It's been a journey at Microsoft/GitHub. We love changing our names every couple of years to, throw you off. Get used to a name, we change it and go, why did they make it that name? Now they're GitHub code spaces. Now GitHub code spaces are hosted in Azure. You get a pre-baked containerized environment out of the box. Why is this handy? How many of you have contractors that work in your organizations? Contractor comes in, they clone the code onto their machine, and they leave with your code. You have no access or ability to say, please take that off your machine. You can ask, but do you think they're really going to do it? How many of you have taken code snippets from a project? You're like, oh, this is a really good, yeah. I got some on there as well. Great ideas, right? But it's not an open source project, but I did something really cool and I want to remember how I did it. So I saved my codes. Why not, right? What's wrong with that? So you have all these people come in, or you're working a team of different types of devices. And we spin up everything into a dev container and put into a repository. So what do code spaces look like? We're going to spin one up in a minute. We're going to do some stuff. A code space is that containerized environment. So we don't have to build a container. We don't have to do all the things that I have to do on my machine because it takes a while to get set up. So when I get started on a project, I get fed up because it takes me too long. I lose interest. Or I'm in the middle of my workday and I get a call and something's more important, like something's on fire, we have a P1 or whatever, right? So I have to stop what I'm doing and pick it up later, and I always lose track of momentum. And because we're bringing everything closer to that developer experience, what if we don't have to leave that code space to do all of our work? So enter an AI. I'm sure you all are tired of hearing about AI. I'm tired of talking about it. I'm actually not tired of talking about it. But it's in every single conversation because it's in so much of our life. And AI is not going to replace us. My colleague Pierre is going to be giving a great session on it tomorrow, more in relation to PowerShell. But when I spin up this code space, we're going to have AI enabled because I need to do things like documentation, and I hate writing documentation. And then I work with a lot of Brits, and Brits are like, oh, we don't use the letter Z, we use the letter S. And I'm like, okay. I like the letter Z. Z for the Americans out there. Okay. So this code space is going to spin up, but this is a fully secure environment. So let's think about my machine, and if I take someone else's machine and start writing my code, pull down my code, I have no control over what's happening on their machine. We all work from home, mostly, right? You have children. I have a giant dog that comes to my office and slobbers on my keyboard. You don't want people having access to that device. We're all traveling right now. What if you lose your device? Is your company going to come after you and like pin you to a wall and say, you're done here because you lost sensitive data? So that code space, we can also set the security parameters around it. That's also a great feature of it. So I can spin up a code space. I don't have to worry about those things. I want to enable my developers to do more. And that's why we have them. And the time to set it up is really, really fast. So instead of talking about slides and things, we're just going to go ahead and demo it out because I like a good demo. Pending nothing breaks. Hello. There we go. Can everyone see this? And just so you know, I went in white mode for all of you. Now, why do developers develop in dark mode? Because light attracts bugs. Sorry, I love that joke. So we have a repository here. I have a git ignore file. I've got a README. So whenever you start a repository, put a README in. Why? What the heck is this repository doing? What do you want it to do? Put licensing in it. If you're open sourcing, put that licensing in. Absolutely put a README. We're going to build out a DevContainer because you should not be creating a repository without a DevContainer. Because if you want to share your code, get started on a project, collaborate, which is the biggest part of our jobs, get a DevContainer in there. So I want to use a couple real-life examples before we go into things. Now, I'm a bit biased. How many of you like PS cones? Okay, a couple people. Wow, okay, I expected like more hands. I was working with a group of IT pros recently and teaching them Git and like all these concepts. And they're like, oh, what's PS cones? I was like, I'll show you. So PS cones has a project. Now, I look at this project or this person's project. 2-3 years ago, they really made updates. What if I find a bug? What if I find an issue in the game? What do? I got to clone their code, submit an issue and all that stuff. But that might take a while. Or any other PowerShell project for that matter. So more specifically, if I go to Pester in their GitHub repo, we can see it's pretty well up to date. Notice this top folder here that says DevContainer. They have a Docker file, and they've got the DevContainer folder right in there for me. So I know when I want to work on this repository, submit some code, help them submit a fix, I have a DevContainer pre-baked. So we can have a look at their Docker file. It just tells them how to build it. So it's pulling from Microsoft's container registry, .NET version. That's fine. Pretty simple. And then when we go into their actual Docker or their DevContainer, this pre-bakes everything we need to work on their code. So getting started on a project, I can see what I need, but it's going to do it for me. So when I get started on any new project, let's say I go back to PS Cones and I want to contribute. I need dependencies installed. C#, PowerShell stuff. This one uses Red Hat. Maybe a slew of other things. And what version do I need? How do we keep it up to date? How do we keep our entire team up to date? By putting everything in the DevContainer file, every time I spin up my code space or my DevContainer, everything is up to date. No one has to keep updating their machine. Ben doesn't have to walk on stage and not run his demo because he ran it locally because he forgot to update something or because he's on a Mac. And Macs hate everything. Macs hate DevContainers. I mean, I work a lot with cloud-native technologies, and that is actually the primary reason why I'm not using my Mac, because inherently on my Mac, it is a pile of dog manure. I hate it. I get frustrated, and I don't want to work. I just want to do my job. I want to write code. I want to do cool things in the cloud. So I took a DevContainer, I spin up in a code space, and I leave my Mac at home because it is a great doorstop. So Ben, if you want to use yours as a doorstop, you're welcome to do that. I used to work on Macs, actually. I have a Mac certification to repair Macs, but I still can validly say I despise them. Right. So back to our demo. I have this repo. It's public for all of you to see. Feel free to break it. Not while I'm doing my demo, please. Okay? Break it after I'm done doing my demo. This has a couple PowerShell scripts in here. It's not crazy. But if you look at this repo and you're going to go, yeah, there's no dev container. What do I need to do to get started? So we can fill out the README and document that. And that is valid. That is important. So normally to get started on a project, I hit the big green code button here. And I go to local and I clone it. Okay? Now I want to fix, now I know in here I have a GitHub Actions workflow, which is how I'm going to deploy my code to the cloud. I'm running some linting. I'm doing some tests on it. And I got some PowerShell scripts. So I have a bunch of dependencies I need to get configured. But I actually don't know because I'm staring at this repo going, oh, that's empty. Huh. What do I need? I didn't give myself enough information. So if I go to code here, I'm going to click on the code spaces button. Now, a couple things happen when I hit this button. It's going to create a code space, but I can do some really cool things about it. I can create a new one with options. I can configure a dev container right from here. Holy crap, that looks easy. I can set up pre-builds. I can manage all my code spaces, and I can actually read the documentation right in the button. How cool is it to have documentation in the button before you push the big red button? So I want to configure a dev container. Here we go. But where do we start? Right? Getting started is the hardest part. Where do we get started? How do we get our entry in? So I can do it right here. It'll create the file for me, and I can commit those changes. Now, I can go into the Pester repo and copy what they did, right? Or I can build it in another way. So we're going to build it another way because it's too hard to go net new for me. It's too much of a learning curve sometimes for me. So I go into this code space, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new one. So again, code spaces are great because we can configure how we want it. So the first thing I can do is I can decide what branch I work off. I always work off my main branch. The other thing I can do is I can decide what region, because we have data residency requirements. We're in Europe, right? Well, sucks for me, I'm in the UK. We have Brexit. So data residency is really tough for us. But fortunately, I can work in Europe. So we have Europe West, we have South Asia, and we have the US. More regions are coming. So if you are UK-based or Switzerland or somewhere that has very specific data requirements, there's more coming along. Fortunately, most of my projects, I can go into Europe West. Then I pick my machine type. So my machine is 3 years old. It's fine. I think it has, I don't know, 32 gigs of RAM, maybe 16 gig. I don't even know anymore. But I'm good at maxing it out. That's what I do know. I can scale this machine out. So if my laptop isn't very sizable, and we get that a lot. We've had hardware acquisition issues recently, right? So I'm going to go ahead and decide what my compute is. I'm just going to choose 2 cores, 4 gigs of RAM because it's easy. Now, if I'm running this code space, it will tell me I need to scale up. They're like, ooh, you're using too much compute. Let's scale you up. So this is building a dev container. So when you build a code space without a pre-baked dev container, it uses a standard file. So if you're getting started on a project, well, that's running through. I'm just going to go ahead and pull up another link. This is going to just build everything while we're running. There is a great link for GitHub Gallery. I should be able to know it. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Oh, sorry, code spaces. Can't even remember my old product. Right. So you can get started for free. You get up to 120 hours per month. The really cool thing is there are some pre-baked code spaces. We have some templates. More are coming. If you want to see more types of templates, great. How many of you write with Jupyter Notebooks? Quite a few of you here. We can spin up this template, spin up a code space. It has everything we need. So actually, while that's running, screw it. Let's run 2 code spaces. What else do we have to do today? So this code space is spinning up. And let's check what our other one is doing. There. So I believe everything has loaded, potentially. Jupyter's loading. Just going to check that it has what I need. It does take a couple minutes to load. It does not have what I need. My bad. Right. So I do have my settings synced. Because I left Microsoft and went to GitHub, I'm having auth issues. So normal people can sync all the extensions they need and have that exact same experience in VS Code. And I could actually open up my VS Code, make a change in VS Code, and see it in my code space, and they'll sync across. But all my extensions, all the tools that I like, all my linting tools are there. I just happen to not be able to find my Copilot tools. So we'll give that a minute to load. So while that's loading, we'll go back to our Jupyter workspace. For people that write Jupyter Notebooks, right? It has a data thing here with a CSV, some false data. Has some notebooks in here to get started with, just to placehold. But if you notice, we have a licensing file. We've got a README, and we can just fill it out. So that's pretty easy to do. And if we go to the dev container folder here, we have our devcontainer.json file. Now, we don't always need, just moving that out of the way. The devcontainer.json file is the critical one. And it does tell us what image we need here. So we're pulling down our image from Microsoft Container Registry. It tells us that we need a couple different extensions, Python extension and Jupyter extension. So you're writing Jupyter Notebooks, use the template. You got 120 hours this month. So when you're done using your code space, you shut it down. You could also set timeouts. So I like to go get a coffee a lot, or I walk the dog. And then I forget to shut down my code space. Now, how many of you have been working in the cloud, forgot to shut down the server and spent like $5,000 overnight, right? Yeah. So how do we put in those guardrails? You can set time limits for your organization of a timeout. So I can do a 30-minute timeout. I believe mine are set to 30 minutes because it takes me more than 5 to make a cup of coffee. So I know 30 minutes is a good time. But you get 120 free hours per month. If you're an enterprise customer, it works a little bit differently, but you can do your thing there. So we can see here that I have this running, and I can start developing my Jupyter Notebook stuff in a dev container. I can share this amongst my team. Open up my VS Code. We're good to go. I know very little about Jupyter Notebooks, so we're not going to go down that road, right? But let's go back to our other code space and see what's happening. All right, everything is loaded. Now, in this experience here, I have a couple things that are happening. So I do have GitHub chat here. I also have a plugin for GitHub Actions. So yesterday in my demo, I was running a few things, and we were running actions to workflows to automate some things. I can see everything here. Context switching. I went and got my cup of coffee. The dog wants a walk. I come back, and I start searching holidays on the internet because it's summer. I forget about my code. Or maybe I need to write my code and I need to search for something. How many of you do that and go to like Google or Bing and say, how do I do this? And then you find something else to look at and we get distracted. So being able to do these things without switching my browser and having everything in one place is really helpful. So having these extensions built in is really, really critical for me. So let's go to the chat feature. So here's Copilot. I can actually chat to Copilot and be like, Copilot, tell me how to do X. Now, I do have my sound turned off because that could be weird. But I'm asked Copilot to build us a dev container. It's thinking. This is internet dependent, by the way. Sorry, it does need coffee. Okay, well, but if you see at the top here, we can ask Copilot to explain the code. So I can go back into that Jupyter notebook and go, what the heck am I doing? And I have Copilot over here as well. We'll just use that Copilot because I have the patience of a gnat. Explain the selected code, Copilot. Tell me how I get started. It can generate tests from my code. Testing is really critical. How many of you love writing tests? Yeah, right? If I make that sound, it just will blast all your ears out. I hate writing tests, but when I came into engineering at Microsoft, I had to learn to write tests for my own code because we don't just have testers anymore. We have full stack teams, so you had to learn to do these things. How do you write better code? Learn to write a test. I'll teach you to write better code, right? So Copilot will help me do that. I have managed to break Copilot today. That's cool. All right, whatevs. Moving on. All right, so we broke Copilot. I'm sure there's no outages in the cloud or anything, ever. Right, here we go. So it's created an output for us. So that was a little slow, but let's be honest. Is that faster than how we probably would have done it together? So I'm going to copy that in. I'm going to go into my go ahead and create a new folder, and top level needs to be top JSON. Yeah, .devcontainer. Okay, I'm not losing my mind. Okay. Oh. So there we go. And then I want to go ahead. Let's ignore you. It didn't save, no. Thank you. User error. Okay, so now I have DevContainer. Oh, I got to rebuild it. Yep, let's rebuild that. So while this is rebuilding, I could ask any one of you to open up your laptop that already has DevContainers configured. Now, Ben does, because he will never go without it. Or log into GitHub, spin up a code space, and you'll have access to this DevContainer. And we're good to go. So it's thinking. We do have outages in the cloud on occasion, by the way. So that's building my DevContainer out. We're good to go. So now we're portable. We're secure. We have all the tools we need. And each and every one of us can pick up this project and run with it and write code. Same thing with the Jupyter Notebook. The other thing I can do is I can set up a live share session from my GitHub code space. You could be on Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code, and we could pair program. I love a good rubber duck. I have a couple good friends. I call and I'm like, hey, help me find this thing. Is Andy here? Andy's not here. They lied. Andy was supposed to be here. I called Andy the other day. Andy found a missing comma in my JSON file. It was magic. All right, so we have our dev container built. We definitely have some issues. Okay, so our file is not correct. So Copilot was 100% correct, but we have a starting point. We can troubleshoot and figure it out. We can ask Copilot to fix it for us. So every repository needs a dev container. We need to make it portable, we need to make it secure, and we need to make sure everyone can work without an issue. So we have a few minutes, well, quite a few minutes left. I'm going to open up the floor to questions and ask away. Is Ben going to be using a dev container / a code space for the rest of his life? Always.
So, okay, I do always. I just wanted to try to avoid destroying the internet.
Ben said he wanted to work locally to avoid destroying the internet. The internet is now 2023, sir. The internet has advanced since 1990. So I used to run the open hack program at Microsoft and go out to customers. We'd have a 3-day hack. We would always spend the first day setting up someone's machine for requirements, especially in the cloud native space. So it takes a while. So it's okay. I broke my terminal last week too. I know why. Easy fix. It's a comm in my JSON. All right, questions? Yes? Can you configure your dev container to run against on-prem? Absolutely. So I can run this on my Visual Studio Code locally. So I can go to that repository, pull it down, and just spin it up. And we could spin it up in VS Code. Do you want to see me do that? Okay. I say that. I don't know where my Docker went. Where'd it go? Okay. My Docker desktop may not be installed anymore. I don't have Docker desktop installed, so for sake of time, because it takes so long to do it locally, and I'd have to reboot my machine. This is why we do things in the cloud. This is why I always use a code space now. It has saved my bacon so many times. I literally can work from anywhere in the world, and it doesn't matter. Yes, Justin. Say that again. P or B? Yes. Yeah, so I can clone this locally that way. Also, when you spin up a dev container, there's an option to send it to VS Code as well. So there's a couple different ways to do it. So I can open up locally if I want to. So let's say my internet died in my house, because that happens never. I can just run this locally, and then when my internet dies, I can then just pull up VS Code. Now, I don't have Docker installed because, yeah, and then I have to reboot, and that's a pain in the butt. We also can use vscode.dev. So that's also another fun one to do. So if I do that, oh, okay. We're just not going to push any more buttons today. Yeah, I actually haven't worked locally on this machine in months. So everything's been in that code space. But everything I do has a dev container, so I can get started quickly. I also tend to work across languages. I might pick up a project with C# involved, which, cool. I work a lot with Golang, especially in cloud native spaces. I can just pick up a project and go. So, yes, sir.
So for a dev container, can you be explicit about versions and extensions?
Yes, for a dev container, the question is, can you be explicit about versions on extensions? Yes, you can. You can absolutely be explicit in that. So going deeper dive into this, we have something called Dependabot at GitHub. It scans your repository and your dev container. So if you're using an outdated piece of dependency software, like NPM, which is a common one we see a lot with, it will pick that up and notify you. It gives you a security, sets up an issue and says, hey, you've got a security threat, you're out of date. So we will tell you if you're out of date, if there's a security hole, a networking issue in the package you're consuming, which is really cool. But yes, you can specify versions, because very often you have to use a very specific version in what you're working on. Again, me, cloud native space, all the time. So the latest and greatest is not always the greatest. Any more questions? Yes, Joe.
Is there any way to do automated testing with a GitHub action?
So is there any way to do automated testing with your GitHub action from your dev container? Yes. So anytime I make changes to my code, I'm going to push that up to my code repository. And I have an action configured, actually, in here, in my GitHub workflows here. Actually, we can just see it from here. I have a couple here. So I actually have an action that will run every time I make a push to my main branch or a pull request. It will run pester testing against my code every single time. So you can bake those in and set your trigger. So this is going a step further. I'm writing my code in that containerized environment. I can then put an action to then scan my code, which was what my session was on yesterday, to then put in checks in place. So before my code actually gets to that repository, we can run those checks. This is great for things like, did you put a password in your code? Is your code valid? Are you running linting tools? So I run linting tools on all my pull requests as well, not in this thing, but we have some pester testing. The other thing we can do is we can output our pester tests from this actions workflow. So when I work with organizations that are like, oh, we have compliance requirements or this, that, we need full traceability, I can output that, store that as an artifact in GitHub, and have full record and traceability. So if something breaks or there is a breach, we have that. So we have a secure development environment, we have a secure traceability environment, and we're running tests through and through everything we do. And I can ask Copilot to give me 100% code coverage if it's working. Any other questions? Yes, in the back, chocolatey. Can you come closer and say that again, please? I'm getting old. My ears are going, maybe. So the question is running this locally on a machine without Hyper-V. I'm not running Hyper-V on my machine at all. So there is a way to run this without Docker locally on my machine. There is a really great blog. And actually, let me pull up my resources now that we're talking about that, because everyone loves a good set of resources to go learn from, correct? I don't have the blog up, but if you all ping me, I will find it. My former colleague, Ben Coleman, wrote a great blog a few years ago. There we go. About how to run a dev container locally without GitHub desktop. So there's a way you can modify using WSL2 to do this. We have some documentation of all kind of what dev containers are at the top, more about code spaces, and then all the, the templates are the middle one, and then the code space documentation is the third link. So we do like that feedback. So yeah, you can do it without having anything locally, but you know, nothing's virtualized on my machine. We can run containerized environments on servers, laptops. You can make them portable to your server environment and develop from that, or machines. Yes, Ben.
Specifically, if you
Yeah, so the feedback is Docker doesn't use Hyper-V inherently. It uses WSL2. That's the way you can bypass it without using Docker Desktop installed, especially when they start charging. But you can use Hyper-V locally if you want to. So if you're running it on like Windows servers and stuff, you can absolutely do that as well. But locally, it chews through CPU. And I don't have enough CPU to chew through these days. Questions, comments? Anyone bring a beer? Is a beer 30? All right. Well, thank you all for joining. Please fire away any questions after. I'll be hanging around for a little bit. And yes, thank you.